I would like to call upon Riley Yes-No to do our land recognition. Riley?
Hello. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of myself and all of the panelists that I am a visitor on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Wendat, Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississauga of the New Credit, and the Métis Nation. And I'd also like to honor and recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land.
Lake of the Woods, where my father was one of the first Aboriginal game wardens in the early 70s and the late 1960s. I'm speaking in sort of like a geographical term. Oh, the chief wants to speak again. I told him to shorten that up. So I'm sort of speaking in geographical terms because you're international. All of the people in this room, there are many of you here who really don't know too much or about Canada per se, or where Lake of the Woods is, or the head of the Great Lakes. So that's where my First Nation is. But I lived for 7 years in Vancouver, and now I have lived here in Toronto on what I like to call Indian Road. I've lived just blocks from here, literally, on Gerrard Street. And on that street, we've got Anishinaabe Health. We have Misway Aboriginal Employment and Training. And right on the other side of the beautiful old Victorian house wall is the Native Women's Resource Center. So, you know, this is all part and parcel of what I like to feel is my Aboriginal community here in beautiful downtown Toronto. And I'm also on the board of directors for HIP, the Toronto Rotarians Honoring Indigenous Peoples Advisory Board. That has opened my eyes and my world to Rotarians over the past 5 years. And I think that the work that Rotarians are doing is outstanding. So I say, let's have a big round of applause for all of you. Yeah. Let that energy level up. So what we're going to do is we have 4 extraordinary panelists, and each one is going to come up and is going to give a 5 minutes about what makes them tick, a little bit about themselves. And then I'm going to have a bit of a conversation with them. But on your seats are white cards. And if you have a question, write it on that card and get it to. If I could just ask, would all of the HIP board members in the room please stand up and just wave your hand? Anyone who's on the HIP board of directors. So take a look. You can see these HIP board of directors. If you've got the cards and you have a question, just hand it to one of them, or just come right up at the end of the table. I'll be the tall guy down there, sitting behind that microphone, and pass those questions on. So now we're going to move down here. We're going to begin with this fantastic man, Mr. Charlie Coffey, who has been a friend of mine for many, many years, and a friend of our community, Mr. Charlie Coffey.
Thank you, Andre. Bienvenue, Ane, Sego, Hansi, Uzo. Good afternoon, one and all. 15 years ago, my then 17-year-old daughter, who was attending Pickering College in Newmarket as a boarder, called me to say, "Dad, I need your help. I need you to come up and have a chat with my graduating class about Indians." She says, "They don't understand very much about your friends." So I developed what was then referred to as Mr. C's 500-year history lesson. So in the next 4.5 minutes, Andre will have me on the clock, I'm going to share with you Mr. C's 500-year history lesson. And what my presentation hopefully will do will put in context for the 3 speakers who follow me. And I start off with this quote from late President Kennedy. He spoke at Yale many years ago. And I use the word myth because of my many years' experience advocating on behalf of First Nations peoples or Indigenous peoples are the myths that surround this issue. So I said to Catherine and her colleagues, why do you think they call them Indians? Anyone know? Thought they found India, the original explorers. Just a reminder, the Aboriginal groups in Canada, or Indigenous groups as they're now known, consist of First Nations, and there are 633 First Nation communities from coast to coast to coast, Métis, and Inuit. So there's 4 chapters in Mr. C's 500-year history lesson. The first being separate worlds, followed by contact and cooperation, and that very dark period in Canadian history of displacement and assimilation. And now, thanks to Rotary HIP, and many of you in this room, we are in that period of reconciliation and renewal. And as we look at the Europeans and the settlers, the relationship to the land was really for economic reasons, and there was very much a reliance on written documentation, where the people that welcomed those early explorers to Canada had a spiritual connection to the land, Mother Earth. And a major difference between the European explorers and the people who welcomed them here was the fact that the Indigenous peoples of this land very much relied on oral history, storytelling. And that contact and cooperation period, and let me just go back for a second. Prior to contact, the ancestors, Riley and Diane, were virtually disease-free, unlimited access to the resources to the land, and I would argue had a political decision-making process that would envy the most advanced democracies of the world. At the time of contact and cooperation, there were some things that were somewhat positive. There were some alliances formed, driven in part by the fur trade and military alliances concurrently. I won't go into the 2 major events or papers listed there, but the Royal Proclamation, if some of you have an interest in, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was signed by King George III. He knew what he was speaking of when he signed that proclamation in 1763. And then, what I describe as a very dark period, and the National Chief referenced the very dark period in Canada's history. Displacement and assimilation. The reserve system. The residential school system. The Indian Act. One could argue very successfully that the Indian Act was one of the most regressive pieces of legislation of any country in the world. And I know Lisa is visiting here from Australia. She knows of similar pieces of legislation in an Australian context, and we'll be taking back, she tells me, some of the learnings from this presentation to share with her colleagues at her school. And now we're in this period of reconciliation and renewal. The National Chief mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I would recommend you reading that, or at least getting acquainted with the 94 calls to action. If you want to go back in history, go back to read the Royal Commission report issued in 1996. And the only thing I will say about reconciliation, and Diane will talk more to this, I expect. Reconciliation is not done to somebody. Reconciliation is done with others on a basis of equality and equal voice and power sharing. You know, some very high-level thoughts that Indigenous peoples could not vote in 1960. They needed a passport to leave the reserve or permission to hire a lawyer. And I will not get into the taxation myth. But I will close with this. The status quo, ladies and gentlemen, is simply not an option. There is a cost to us as society, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to doing nothing. But there's also a cost to not doing enough. So I will simply leave you with a quote from my favorite author, the late Maya Angelou. And she said this, I'm paraphrasing a bit. People may forget what you say, and people may forget what you do, but people will never, ever forget how you make them feel. Your presence here today to learn more about Indigenous issues makes me, as a Canadian and a long, long time advocate on behalf of Indigenous peoples, very proud to have you in our presence today. And when you leave today and go back to your hotel, I have my last comment, a favor to ask of you. I want you to find a mirror, eye contact with yourself, find your heart and your soul and your spirit, and simply say, I am going to do something about reconciliation. Okay? Not because Charlie Coffey wants you to do, but my sense is your presence here now convinces me you want to. With that, as you leave today, go in peace. Thank you.
I just want to point out something as well, that I am I work for the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. I am the Director of Awards and Stakeholder Relations. And you know, Rotary, I think, has a little bit to do with business, so I just wanted to make that plug. It's an important plug because there are billions of dollars in Aboriginal economic activity taking place across this country. We have 633 First Nations out there, and you can be rest assured where resource development or different kinds of development are taking place in Canada today, that you're going to intersect with our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So next, I would like to call upon Diane Redsky to come and
My voice does project, so that's, those of you at the back may have to close your ears because that can be loud. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to thank HIP, Honoring Indigenous People, Rotary, again for the opportunity to be here. My English name is Diane Redsky. My traditional name is Shweganun Anishinakaz Dikdodam, which means love eagle from the Caribou clan. And this is a whole, it's a lifetime of learning of what that means and what responsibilities that brings. I have my most important job is being a mother to 3 and a grandmother to one very powerful 8-year-old. You can imagine what her world is like. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Riley for introducing the traditional territory, because I do believe that is really important, because we all have the privilege of being on this territory, and it's important to acknowledge and give thanks for that privilege of being on Anishinaabe territory. So the heart medicine work that I've had the privilege of being involved in much of my career, so over 20 years now, has been working in our Indigenous community in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and little parts of Ontario, because I'm from the Treaty 3 Nation, the Ojibwe Nation. How many of you have been to Winnipeg? Just raise your hand. Oh, good. Excellent. So when you have flushed the toilet or taken a shower, you can thank a red sky, because the water that is shipped from our community into Winnipeg, and so you thank us for that. You can think of me when you're having a shower. So this heart medicine work over the last 20 years is really not even a job. It's an extension of who I am as an Indigenous woman, as a leader, wanting to use my voice, and early on seeing the inequality and equity of different races of people. And so I've dedicated much of my work to doing heart medicine work, and that is primarily has taken up my work at the Mama Wichita Center, which is an organization, a nonprofit, non-mandated, Indigenous-led organization in Winnipeg, which is looking at rebuilding families from the inside out, looking at rebuilding communities from the inside out, or bottom up, whichever way you view community development work. And that has really led us to a lot of the reality for Indigenous people is that it's not like we don't know how to care for our families and care for ourselves. It's always been about giving the opportunity to secure the resources to do things our way, to empower our Indigenous knowledge of caring and rebuilding our families. And so much of the work of the Mama Wichita Center has been based on those Indigenous values of how we care for our families. And I think that is another myth that happens often. We're often viewed as Indigenous people as we don't have the answers because we're just poor people who are not privileged and know very little. And in fact, that's not the truth. There is an inherent strength within our communities and how we have made decisions and how we have operated our communities. And given the opportunity with the resources, we can help realize that. And so that brought us to a really special program that we developed over 15 years ago called the Family Group Conference Program. And we met a very powerful woman over 15 years ago that introduced us to her family and her nation in New Zealand, the Maori people. And Rima will be talking a little bit more about that special relationship. And so what we recognized immediately, what they were doing that we didn't have the opportunity to do here, is that they were utilizing a process called Family Group Conferencing, which is an Indigenous model to keeping kids in families and empowering the families to make decisions on the care and protection of children, and creating a very distinct role for the Child and Family Service System in not making those decisions on behalf of families. That families are the ones that are making the decisions based on their own values and their own ways of making decisions to care for kids. And so we wanted to learn more about the Maori people using an Indigenous model in working with mainstream systems, the mainstream child and family service systems. So we started doing that 15 years ago. And we grew and have been silently working at it over the years and developing our relationship with our Maori family, developing the relationship both within the child and family service sector, and producing significant results. In 15 years, the average reunification rate of children going back to their families was 79% within 3 months of apprehension, because we want the kids home fast when you can get a family engaged right at the very beginning, how critically important that is. And so we wanted to make that more normal as a system, instead of having it just as a program over here in isolation. And so we did the math and we created the package to prove our value, to show our outcomes, we're having positive effects. And with some funding support from a variety of funders, we were able to expand this program to triple the size of it. And so to lead and help us lead that expansion, Rima has come from New Zealand to ensure that we keep the cultural integrity of our program as we expand it. And so she'll be talking a little bit more about that role. And so just in the 8 months that we have expanded, we're already up to 93% of reunification rate of getting children back home to their families because it's a family that's deciding. And so my key message here today, and we brought some pamphlets and bookmarks for everybody. My key message here today is that sometimes it's not about looking outward for the answers. It's about communities looking inward for the answers. And there's lots of power in that decision making and lots of power in that way of working with our community.
Thank you, Diane. And now I would like to call upon our sister from New Zealand, Rima Ritanga.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mahara mai, I roi ki tēnei whenua, nā mihi kia koutou katoa, nā tangata whenua kia konei, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for having me. Welcome to you all from all the different nations. I'd like to acknowledge the HIP collaboration that has invited me here today. I also want to acknowledge that the work that they do is a celebration for Indigenous people, absolutely. So, I'm just getting the hand down there. Okay. I have a timer because I've been told that we only have 5 minutes. Keep me on track, Charlie. Okay, kia ora. My name is Rima Ritanga. I have 10 children and I have 10 grandchildren. I'm here in Canada to help build the capacity of family group conferencing, which is an Indigenous tool that belongs to us as Māori. We have used this tool since our creation, and what it's allowed us to do is it has allowed us to acknowledge our connection to the land, our connection to the sky, and our connection to the natural resources that we as Māori live in harmony with. The natural resources for us is how we sustained our lifestyles. And as Māori, when I gave birth to my 10 children, I was merely the mother that gave birth. But the care and the protection and nurturing of my children belonged to my whole village. So that's the concept that family group conferencing comes from. Because within that concept, every person in my village has a role and a responsibility to ensure that that newborn is brought up absolutely within his or her genealogy, that is also raised with all the cultural and Indigenous knowledge that has been passed down since our creation, that this child, you know, it's really funny because in my culture, we don't have a word for abuse. Because prior to colonisation, we never had any. We also had our own governance. We had one man who was the man, but that man also had a responsibility to every other member in our village. So any decisions that were made within our village were made like this, where if something had to change within our lifestyle, or if someone had to take on a different responsibility, it was made like this, because not one person had one role, but everybody was responsible for every role. So when I talk about family group conferencing as our Indigenous tool, it allows families in this setting to be responsible, to be held accountable, but absolutely to be part of the answer. So having family group conferencing here is it's really powerful for me because it's enabled me to come over and, one, acknowledge the closeness of our cultures. The Indigenous culture here, it's like a twin culture to mine. So coming over here to help build the capacity for family group conferencing is not hard. Because these people live the way we live. They live by what we live by. They call on all their ancestral knowledge and mātauranga, which is what we call it, and they walk that talk prior to colonisation, of course. So now I'm here as part of a strategy to build their capacity to have Indigenous children that have been apprehended return to their families, if not to their parents, then to their bloodlines and genealogy. Because how can a non-Indigenous person raise an Indigenous child to be the best goddamn Indigenous person they can be? Thank you. So in New Zealand, family group conferencing is legislated. There are a couple of issues around that. Holy, that went fast! Anyway, the key to family group conferencing is, so in 2015 we came over here, my family, and we gifted the concept of family group conferencing to Mamawai. And we did that because since the year 2000 we had seen the evidence that they were using it in its truest spirit, indigenously. So, now that my 5 minutes is nearly up, I have to say, my priority, now that I'm standing here, is that we have formed a trifecta. There is Mamawai at the top, there are families over here, and CFS over here who hold the children. The key is building relationships within this trifecta so that everybody is aware and educated that these Indigenous children have a right to be raised by their Indigenous bloodlines. How do we do that? Yeah, that's the hard part, because we have to build a relationship with, and don't get offended people, with the colonisers. But in doing that, we have to try and enlighten them and give them an insight into what it is to be Indigenous, because that is the only way this is going to be successful. But I have to say, I want to finish with this trifecta and the whole concept of family group conference. It cannot succeed without CFS. That is the trifecta relationship that is going to reunify all these Indigenous children. Thank you very much for your time.
Now I would like to call upon Riley Yes/No to speak.
Thank you. Bonjour, Anin, Riley Yes/No Nunjuka, Yamantung First Nation, Njunjuba, Anishinaabe Udu. And that was basically me saying, hi, my name is Riley Yes/No. I am from Yamantung First Nation in Northern Ontario, also known as Fort Hope First Nation. And I went to high school in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and I'm currently living in Toronto, so, or my home. And today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the work that I've done and sort of bring a youth perspective to this panel. In my short journey so far on Mother Earth, I've had the opportunity to live and study with some really amazing people. So I lived in Berlin, Germany for a year studying reconciliation after World War II. And I was able to live in New Zealand as well, which is where I always say I tapped into my ancestors for the first time. And yeah, and also in Australia and studying the Indigenous people of Australia as well. And from all of that, I was able to take those experiences and now work with the Prime Minister on the Prime Minister's Youth Council to advise him on issues that matter to Canadian youth, which is everything. And from that, something that's guided me in all of my talks about reconciliation, about Indigenous people, Indigenous equity, was a teaching that was gifted to me from an elder, and it's sort of become a guiding principle for me in my work, and I wanted to share it with you guys today when we engage in these conversations. So this elder told me that there are three pillars to reconciliation that we always have to keep in mind. There's reconciliation between Indigenous people in Canada, in the Canadian state, and the Crown, and a lot of those conversations have to do with decolonization and indigenization of institutions and services. The second pillar is the pillar between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and that has a huge conversation around allyship, around recognizing things like trauma porn, and recognizing your role as a settler and how to be a settler and not a colonizer, and that there's a huge distinction to be made there. And the third pillar that I think is often overlooked in our conversations is the most important pillar, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and themselves, and the work that has to be done there first. You can only build a community from the ground up, I say. So, and that sort of work, the one that really keyed into me for that was about a couple months ago, actually probably about a year ago now. I was working with INAC, and we were hosting a conference on child welfare. And they asked me to come and speak, and they said, I want you to share with all of us your dream for your people. And so I was like, okay, gotta make this a good one, my dream for my people guy. So I came up with a list, like miles long. I was like, we want education rates equal to non-Indigenous Canadians, clean water for everyone, going on and on, infrastructure, housing, you name it. And then as I got up there and I was reading this list, I realized that this was the reconciliation of the third pillar that I had to do within myself. Because when did my dreams for my people become so mundane that my dream for my people was water? That's the expectation. So that's what I realized, the internal colonization that all Indigenous people in the world and in Canada face, and the work that I had to do to address that third pillar, because as Leanne Simpson would say, communities, strong communities are born out of individuals being the best versions of themselves. And in order to be the best version of myself for my community, I had to kind of look at that. And so the last thing I want to really highlight is the importance of having youth in these conversations and engaging them in doing these things. The Prime Minister, who's also the Minister of Youth, once said the reason why he was so passionate about youth and appointed himself as Minister is because for adults, they have a less willingness to change. For youth, physically, emotionally, spiritually, experientially, we're always changing. And so we're more quick to adapt to it, to recognize it, and to embrace it. And so for that reason, we're the most innovative, the most creative, and the most strong and resilient. So when you're having these conversations, it's important to make sure that you have that representation and that voice, and Indigenous youth especially, because we're told that trauma is bred into our DNA, but nothing like resilience and strength. So that's where I want to leave my nice 5-minute speech. I hope that you can ask me some hard questions. Thank you.
The name of what this panel here is today is Indigenous Leaders, Success in Action. So this is a pretty broad conversation we're having and we're about to have. But I would like to just ask each of our panelists if you can just tell me one example of Indigenous leaders and success. One example from maybe your life experience. And Diane, if I may, could I just start with you? Do you have something that you think is success?
Well, I think, and I have always been a strong advocate for really encouraging everybody, particularly young people, on the power of a letter. And that is a way for you to communicate your voice. And one example of a power of a letter in Manitoba, while I was pregnant with my son 19 years ago, I realized that we had laws in Manitoba that actually prevented me from the Indigenous ceremony of naming Indigenous children the way that we do it in our community, that there was a law that prevented that from happening. And so I wrote a letter and highlighted that to the Minister of Vital Statistics at that time. And government agreed and changed the law before my son was born, so actually fast-tracked it through, which honors the traditional naming of children. And so my son is the very first child born in Manitoba with a spirit name and his clan. And so that's a on being able to also change something that's important and that now allows other Indigenous families to go through that ceremony when their child is born.
Excellent. Thank you. Charlie?
To me, it's, I'm going to ask this question somewhat indirectly, but it's showing up. My point is about showing up and showing leadership, whether it be in the Nass Valley in northwestern BC or Pond Inlet in Nunavut, or dance the jig with the Métis people in Winnipeg. But it was for me showing up at a specific example of leadership, and Andre, you know this guy well. David Tuckaroo started with one truck in the oil sands in Fort McMurray many years ago. The president of Syncrude said, I think you have something to contribute, David. He was a Cree from Fort Chipewyan. he, 25 years later, sold his business for $165 million. The guy started with a pickup truck working the oil sands. So my message to you and the theme of this conference is, if you have an opportunity to engage with Indigenous people, do so. Remember what Maya Angelou said. You don't care what you say or what you do, is how you make them feel. They are ancestors of the first peoples of this country. And lastly, my journey started in the mid-1800s when my great-grandfather migrated from Cork, Ireland, and settled in the upper St. John River Valley of New Brunswick. And it was the Maliseet peoples of the upper St. John River Valley who helped him survive. That's why I'm here. So it's payback.
Thank you, Charlie.
So for me, my idea of success may be a little bit more, I think, based in that my one good friend, Cody Zachariah, he's from the Canadian Federation of Students, and I asked him one day how he resists, what his form of resistance is. And he responded to me quite simply with, my resistance is existence. And that really got me thinking, because for Indigenous people and for Indigenous youth, we're growing up in a system that was fundamentally made for us to not exist and to not succeed. So for every day that you go out in the world and you share your truth and you simply exist, that is a version of success. And I don't think that can be understated. So that for me is success.
Success for me, I've been here since March from New Zealand. Success for me is working at Mamawai. I go to Mamawai every day. And recently there has been an evacuation of 2 reserves that have been brought into Winnipeg. Within Mamawai, they have a youth contingent of 30 youth. And what these 30 youth did for nearly 6 weeks, I think, every day, they were split up into teams. These evacuees were all separated into something like 18 hotels. These 30 youth did a roster and went into each hotel every day on 5-hour shifts to entertain the children that came from these 2 reserves. So this is empowerment and success, because Mamawai is building the leaders of tomorrow, and the responsibility they took was awesome. So that's success for me. Kia ora.
We have got an amazing number of questions, okay? So I just want to be upfront with you all that your question may not get up here, but it's not because we're not trying. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start asking some of these questions, and if I could ask our panelists to try and keep the answers pretty, tight, if we could, because we want to try and get to more, but we can build this conversation out. This is a very interesting question, and anyone who wants to jump in on this one, please do. Although, Diane, I think you might be probably best suited to answer this one question. How does a Rotary Club, white, middle-aged colonizer's background start to help without recolonizing? That's an interesting question. Anybody here in the room write that? No, just kidding. So what do you think, Diane?
Okay, well, very good question, and that's oftentimes, that question is asked a lot, and really the reason why HIP was created in the first place was to bridge that gap between Indigenous communities and the family, the Rotary family. And one of the foundational pieces of HIP is, I'm going to answer it because it's the same answer I would give to that specific question, is that it's rooted in relationships and taking the time to build relationships within the community, recognizing with the lens on of looking for strengths and gifts within that community. Not what's wrong with it, or to move within a charity model of giving. Much of our value base is a value base on balance. And so building a relationship with the community is looking at it from a long-term and a strength-based is you will have much success. And I would like Charlie to also talk about this, because I really do think it's important, and I have always valued his role on speaking about the reconciliation and speaking about the process of building those relationships, and I believe that he would also have a lot to offer in answering this question.
Andre, to your point, I'll be very, very brief. I was transferred to Winnipeg in the summer of 1989 to head the Royal Bank's operations there. Within a month of my arrival, I met Phil Fontaine, who at the time was the Grand Chief. The heads of the banks had a monthly meeting, and Phil Fontaine was the guest. I asked him somewhat naively, I said, Mr. Fontaine, how do you view the banks in this town, Winnipeg, in terms of the treatment of your people? His eyes flashed, he took out a piece of paper and he wrote, friend, foe. I said, Mr. Coffey, I want you to know that every bank and every banker in this room is on the foe side of the ledger. That's how we keep score in our culture. I went to see him the next day and was reminded that just a year earlier, prior to my arrival, J.J. Harper, who Diane will remember, an Indigenous activist, was shot and killed by a Winnipeg police officer under what the inquest determined to be strange circumstances. But that preamble set me on a course of understanding, because I toured Winnipeg at Phil Fontaine's suggestion, and I said to myself, this is not the Canada that I know. We have an obligation to speak up and to speak out. And with the encouragement of senior officers at Royal Bank, I was able to use the bank's platform in a small way to try to make a difference. But developing that trust relationship is also critical. Treating one another as equals and sharing, if not giving up, power to Indigenous peoples.
What is a Métis? Is there an official legal definition? We were taught in history that it was a mix of French, Canadian, and Indigenous ancestry. Now it seems to be a biracial person of Indigenous and non-Indigenous blood. If so, what is the percent of Indigenous DNA that a person must have to be Métis, or is it a self-definition? Well, that's a very interesting question. Who would like to jump on that? Riley, you go.
Okay, so I don't know that I necessarily know the legal definition of a Métis person, but what I do know is that for years and for decades, the Métis people were considered as such largely by the Canadian population, half Indigenous and half white, or half non-Indigenous. And the Métis have worked very hard to reassert themselves as their own people with their own culture and their own language, and not a half person, not a half Indigenous person, but a full Métis person with their own language and their own traditions. So that, I think, is really important to know, and that if you ever encounter a Métis person or meet a Métis person, also you brought up something very interesting about the idea of how much blood and how much percent DNA do you have to be a Métis person. I think this is a problem overarching for all Indigenous people in this country, is the really problematic idea of blood quantum, because that is inherently a very colonial way of defining citizenship and nationhood, in that Indigenous people are not determined by the amount of blood that they have coming from a certain area. It's the way that they walk in the world, it's their people, it's their culture, it's their community. And we never had any sort of system before colonization in which we determined your worth or your status based on what was in your blood. So,
in New Zealand, if you are seen by society as being part black, and part of that is Māori, then to Māori, you're all Māori.
Yeah, hear, hear. Well, this question is for Diane. What is the meaning behind the land recognition statement, and why is it important for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples?
What is really important in our value base, and we're connected spiritually, we're connected on all the levels emotionally to our land base. And land to us is significantly important to us, because that's our connection to Mother Earth. So wherever we are in our territories, we belong to a specific area. And in fact, in my nation, the Ojibwe Nation of Treaty 3, when a child is born, that umbilical cord that falls off in a week or so, that is actually placed on the land in a special ceremony within your First Nation community or within your territory, because it's seen as that child will always be connected to that land, so they will never be lost and crisscrossing here and there, trying to find out who they are. They will always have a place at home, rooted in their value base. And so that connection to the land is very significant in our community. And and that's why we also have treaty land entitlement discussions, because much of it was just taken, and we are working at reclaiming much of that land base as well, because if we don't have the land, we would wander.
Thank you. This question was for Riley. Can you expand on settler versus colonizer, please?
For sure. So basically, it's a very simple idea in premise, in that the idea is that if you are not an Indigenous person to this land, then you are a settler, no matter how many generations of your family have been here. However, there's a big distinction to be made, because colonizer is somebody who actively in their day-to-day lives works to eliminate the presence of Indigenous people on this land. A question to ask yourself in all of your actions and everything you do is, am I being a good visitor here? Am I being a good neighbor and a good citizen on this land? Or is what I'm doing right now destructive to the original people here? And if the answer is yes to the latter half of that question, then you're being a colonizer. And that's an important thing to recognize within yourself, and it's a constant reflection to do in your day-to-day actions, but it'll help you be a better ally and help you better address one of those 3 pillars that I was mentioning earlier.
In the effort to reunify children with the family, what is considered a family? 2 parents, or are there other family units that work for child reunification? Rima?
If you ask an Indigenous person what is a family unit, you'll have to have some time. Every Indigenous person born of this earth comes with a genealogy, as do you all. So asking that type of question, it's a societal question, and not even an Indigenous society actually, because had it been an Indigenous question, then the answer would have been that the unit of a family for an Indigenous child will be as big as this room, all the people in it. The barrier is society, settler, colonizer, whatever you want to call it, has so broken down these families, these cultures, their values and their concepts of self, that everything now is a unit. A mother, a father and 2 children. Jesus Christ, I got 10 children! So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. Yeah, that's what. Charlie, this question came up, and it's open, but I want to ask you particularly. How are you not angry with the history and ignorance, question mark, or how do you deal with the anger?
As the 7th of 9 kids growing up in Woodstock, New Brunswick, my mother taught me at a very early age, don't get angry, Charlie, do something about it. So now I don't, I harbor disappointment in various lack of action and proposals by governments and civil society generally, but anger would not be part of my DNA, so to speak.
Thank you.
But action is. Okay? And I would say this, and I think it applies to everybody dealing with these very, very, very tough issues. And that is, we must all get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We must all get comfortable with being uncomfortable as we debate and discuss these issues on behalf of the First Peoples of this great country.
Thank you. Diana, did you want to
Yeah.
comment?
I just wanted to say that we all have a choice to make. We can be part of the solution or part of the problem. And how we decide to use our time and all of that. And that's critically important, particularly in the work that you do. And just by being here today, by learning more about the work that Honoring Indigenous People Circle is doing to bridge that gap. There is a very safe way and a respectful way in which to build those bridges between Indigenous and Rotary, between Indigenous communities and Rotary. And so there are, and that's where you have an opportunity to be part of the solution. And so you can't help but naturally be impacted by inequality, by inequity, by violence, and by systems who perpetuate harming people, regardless of what they are. And so we use that energy to be part of the solution. And so again, I want to thank and acknowledge all of you for being here, because sometimes it's a first step by just recognizing that there's a problem to be solved. And then from there, you make the choice whether to be part of the solution or part of the problem. Make it.
I just wanted to really quickly add, because I was given a really great teaching about this as well, and that this one elder told me that all of our actions are based out of one of three things, either love, anger, or fear. And of those three, fear is the worst to do any sort of action out of. And so I'm going to be honest, when I see the history of this land and the enduring oppression and marginalization of my people, I am angry. I'm very angry. But it's okay, because anger is one of the most useful and explosive fires and fuels in your body to accomplish change. It's just important to also make sure that you balance out that anger with love for yourself and love for your people, and so that the fire doesn't overtake you and the anger doesn't overtake you, because that can only fuel you for so long. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I think it's good and productive to be angry so long as you know how to harness that.
How can I, as a non-Indigenous high school student, contribute to reconciliation in Canada?
That's a great question. I think the point in there about school is really important, because I also firmly believe the quickest way to expedite any process of reconciliation is through education. So education, whether it's a formal Western institution or outside of the classroom, education and educating yourself about the history of your land, the people that are sitting in your classroom, is exponentially, I keep saying exponentially important in the way that you interact and become a good ally. I would also say that if you're in high school, and I'm assuming going to graduate high school, you are ahead of 60% of First Nations youth in this country, which means that you are in a position of privilege and a position of leadership. And as an ally and as a student, it's your job to not so much, I think, provide a microphone for these voices, but rather create space for your Indigenous brothers and sisters and your Indigenous peers to be able to reassert themselves in the way that they see fit. So we'll give them space to build capacity and to insert themselves into dialogues and into conversations. So yeah, I think that's more for everyone as well, to touch on the idea of allyship. But as a student, I would really push for looking very critically at your education. I always say that we don't need mandatory Indigenous education or Indigenous history in this country, because we already have it. It's called Canadian history, and it's just not taught properly.
What I would also tell, particularly the young people, about reconciliation is that let's not forget the truth part. We oftentimes want to be quick to solve the problem without taking the time to clearly understand exactly what happened and what needs to be fixed. And our elders have already cautioned us since the Truth and Reconciliation 94 Calls to Action was released, that we've even taken truth out of the word truth and reconciliation already. And so we have to be very, very careful about not wanting to get to the finish line right away, because what's happening now is that we're leaving a whole bunch of people behind. And that's not what it was intended for. And so our elders have also clearly said, if truth and reconciliation ever becomes easy, then you're doing it wrong. And so we need to be able to do the hard work, have those really uncomfortable conversations, and then moving it into action, which means that somebody has to gain and somebody has to give up. That is part of the really important progress that our community really needs to do. And so when, especially the young people who oftentimes, we call that time in their life as the fast life. But also for us as adults, we want to be quick to solve a problem, and we just need to be very careful and make sure, do a stop and check often. Are we leaving anybody behind in doing this? And please don't forget, and I would advocate strongly that we all collectively say we're not separating the words truth from reconciliation, that we have to keep them together, because we can never forget about telling the truth part.
What is the most dangerous myth that you believe is important to educate Canadian people on?
I've heard people, senior people, say, with respect to Indigenous peoples, we overpowered you, get over it.
Yeah.
There are lots of myths around who pays, who doesn't pay income tax. As I said, there's a podium, I'm not going to get into that. The biggest myth is what John F. Kennedy said. It's not necessarily that consistent lie, but those myths, due to lack of understanding at the definition of a Métis, who are First Nations. We haven't even ventured to talk about the Inuit, formerly known as Eskimos. There are 1,001 myths, and to Diane's point, you've got to capture the truth around those and deal with them as best you can, whether it be at dinner conversations or your Rotary Club meetings, and be prepared for uncomfortable discussions. You know, and just by wrap up of this, that was a longer answer than you'd like on your press. When I was a senior person at the Royal Bank, make no bones about it, folks, I knew my job was to enhance shareholder value. Meet or exceed budget, or the President Gordon Nixon or John Clayton would kick my butt out of there. But I was also referred to internally as the, when it came to Indigenous issues, the bleeding heart liberal. And that's why I put on my sign here, social justice warriors. But I was able to marry the two. There's no difference between reaching out to Indigenous people and enhancing shareholder value for your businesses. We used to have senior Indigenous leaders come into the bank, and they say, you don't have the cheapest prices, Charlie. Your products are expensive. But you understand us, and we trust you.
There's two things that I'll talk briefly about in terms of the dangerous myths. Is there's a lot of people don't know the difference between the treaty and the Indian Act. They think they're the same thing. A treaty is an agreement signed between my people and the Queen over land base, etc. There's lots of things within a treaty, but that is the nation-to-nation relationship. The Indian Act, on the other hand, created special rules in addition to Canadian citizens. So I'm a First Nation person in Canada. I have rules like all of you, but I even have more rules because of the Indian Act that sets out, that were established to create more rules for us on what we can do and what we can't do, particularly what we can't do. And so the Indian Act was established because Indigenous people at that time were considered less than human. So because they're considered less than human, they need more rules about what they can do and what they can't do. And so that has been a really important part of clarifying that we have rights. We are rooted in rights through our treaties, and the Indian Act is what we're trying to change because it's driven by special rules because we're less than human. The second thing is that what people also don't realize, and is another myth, that the systems are still set up to make us fail. That we still have a long way to go when it comes to changing the systems that continue to perpetuate colonization, that are out there to make us fail. And so there are lots of things that we need to change, and lots of systems we need to change, particularly for Indigenous women and girls in our country, because they are the most marginalized. They got the Indian Act rules, they got this rule, they got that rule, and then they have systems coming at them at all angles. And so we need to really change the systems to really have better outcomes for our people.
This is a great question, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. And for me, the most dangerous myth to educate Canadians on, the myth is that Canada is a great country. That Canada is inclusive and progressive and inviting and just ahead of the 8 ball on everything. Go to any Indigenous community, go to any reservation, and they will tell you that that's not true. And so you really have to apply the principle of an injustice against one of us is an injustice against all of us. And so what I've found in my travels, and as I mentioned, when I was living in Berlin studying reconciliation, the reason why they were able to accomplish reconciliation in the way that they did and at the speed that they did was because of the international accountability that they had to address that, you know? Like, their government was in shambles, their economy was shot, but their one main priority was making sure that nothing like this would ever happen again to these people or to anybody in the country of Germany. Now, if you go anywhere on an international stage, it doesn't matter if the Prime Minister goes to the United Nations and say, we did horrible things to Indigenous people in this country. People look at Canada and they go, oh, Canada, that's just like you, Canada, apologizing. How nice of you, Canada. And so there's absolutely no external or internal pressure due to the uneducated Canadian population about the injustices perpetuated against Indigenous people. And so that allows the Canadian government and the Canadian people to perform acts of reconciliation at their own pace. And that's not how reconciliation works. And so if we keep basing ourselves and our national identity in this idea that we're great, that's Canadian complacency. And I would urge everybody, anywhere you go then, to make sure that you are not framing Canadians in that sort of way, not framing the country in that way, and that your actions and your words reflect that.
Can you share how you would like Rotary International to become a partner in reconciliation? Footnote, as we reach the end of the Polio Plus campaign, how courageous would it be to make reconciliation a Rotary goal?
Well, I think you answered your question, number one, and the work that Honoring Indigenous People Circle is doing can be helpful in your process to build those bridges. And I'm sure that many of you, and I'm hoping that many of you know what HIP is. If not, I know they have materials in the back, and encourage you to be connected to this organization, because they are half Rotary and half Indigenous people, created a very powerful circle to lay the groundwork and the foundation to answer all of those questions in a meaningful way that is going to have the highest impact and the most success for you, because we have done it ourselves as a circle and are developing the resources to help you do your important work in your communities. And again, it's rooted in the relationships and looking at ways to, through the lens of a strengths-based lens, and seeing and viewing things also that you're looking for an equitable relationship where you are key partners with the Indigenous organizations or groups or communities that you are intending on outreaching. And so absolutely, I would love to see however you do that governance and that decision making of endorsing the 94 calls to action, and in fact picking out those specific calls to action on truth and reconciliation that becomes part of the international Rotary agenda moving forward. I'd love to see that.
question is for you.
Okay, are you sure?
Awesome. How do you deal with families who have adopted Indigenous children where the children may not want to leave?
That's a good question. and we have to think about the balance in that. So if a non-Indigenous couple has adopted an Indigenous child and they grow up and they don't want to leave, are they grown up? Let's just think about that. If these children are young and they are not grown up and they have the inherent right to be within their own bloodline, then that is a responsibility that we have to ensure that that happens. The challenge though then would be to ensure that there is an engagement and a positive relationship between both relationships, both sets of parents, both cultures, to ensure that this child is raised knowing that they have a beautiful balance. Because they're going to grow up to be an adult where they will then make a choice, but they will make a choice because their parents make the best effort to ensure that both their sides are being raised, have been acknowledged. So then the power is given back to the child. Because you know, we're all adults and we do what we do by choice, but when we raise children, Indigenous or not, they don't have a choice. So when our children grow up and they're whatever it is we've made them, we need to remember we made them.
Thank you. You know, we're coming close to the end, and I really want to say thank you so much because I think that what we've got, what we've had here are some really great questions, and we've really gone over so much. I've got one more question here, and I'm going to give this one here to Riley, if I may. Our Rotary Club, well, maybe Diane or Riley, so that's what it says up here, okay? But you'll see why. Our Rotary Club has encountered resistance to joining with our Native community from the Band Council. Any comment or suggestions about this issue?
Well, and again, it's rooted in relationships, right? And so, somebody tells me no, I'm going to figure out another way. And so there's a reason why there is a hesitancy and fear sometimes of First Nation communities building relationships outside of their community or with non-Indigenous people. There's a lack of trust, and I think we can all agree, rightfully so. And that takes time to build. And so there may, and you have to commit to the time to build those relationships and not to give up, because I think it's all too often, it's easier to, well, it's hard to do that heavy lifting work at the beginning to build relationship and to build trust. But I would encourage people not to give up on that and understand where the hesitancy and the pushback is coming from, and it will take time.
So I have a story that I think will explain my perspective on this well. It's a bit convoluted, but bear with me, it'll come back around. So my best friend is from Nigeria, and every Christmas her and I send packages back to her village in Nigeria with things for Christmas and supplies that they need and whatever. Basically, the people in the community send us a list of things that they want us to send them. So this year we got the list, and for an adult woman, that she was saying that she wanted pads for menstruation. And I was like, well, you know, like, I think that she should have a diva cup, because that would make so much more sense. It's reusable, it's whatever, there's less waste, blah, blah, blah. And Soma looked at me and she said, it's her name, my friend from Nigeria, and she said, that's not what she asked for. And I said, but you don't understand, it's better. I know that it's better for her. Objectively, it is. And she was like, that is not what she asked for. When she asks for it, then you can give it to them. And so that's kind of the main idea I would say to that. When the Indigenous people are ready for you, they will ask you, and they will be there. And in the meantime, I would work to prove yourselves through acts of reconciliation. Make sure that when they do approach you, you're in a position of allyship and you have the resources to be able to give them to really make that foundation of that relationship. But when they're ready, they will come to you and they will ask.
What's also important is how people approach communities as well. Communities have traditional protocols on how you engage with a community, and every community is different, depending on where they are in the country, depending on their own history, and so finding out what those traditional protocols are. It could be offering tobacco to the elder, it could be meeting the chief for coffee, it could be whatever their traditional protocols are, and usually if you can connect with somebody in the community, they can let you know what those traditional protocols are on approaching. And so when you're approaching a community based on their value base and honoring their community, then that's a step in the right direction, and oftentimes can be the first step in building a relationship, not on your terms, but on their terms.
Okay, now, I would like to ask each of our panelists to please, if you've got anything that you want to impart in parting words, you've got 1 minute.
Seek first to understand, and secondly, this is a journey, not a destination, okay? Reading this theme, but Diana said it so well, building that trust. And lastly, I want you to understand, at least my learning is that the Indigenous community in Canada is not a homogeneous group. The Haida and the Niska and the Coast Salish and the West Coast are very different from the Crees of Quebec, who are very different from the Malasite and the Mi'kmaq and the Maritimes. Okay? We can't lump them all in together, but just, I ask of you, as I said, when you look in that mirror, just please take one simple step. Reach out, and you will be rewarded handsomely with a new friend.
Well, again, I would just like to comment on it and reiterate some of the key messages that we wanted to bring here today, and that is that the strength of Indigenous people, that we do have the answers, we just need the opportunity and be supported with the resources in order to do it. We have solutions to every single one of the problems that we face every day, and to tap into that strength. The other thing is that to look at us as through a strength-based lens is really, really critically important. It is such a slippery slope to go from a charity model to a real community building model. And that's another thing I caution people is it's easy to give the money and feel good and walk away, and it's a different kind of person that wants to stick around and be part of building the solutions so that there's long-term impact and real systemic change, so that we are not continuing to perpetuate this circle of over and over and over again, that we're actually at some point like stopping it from happening, and encourage you to look at your role in helping Indigenous communities.
Okay. Reunifying Indigenous children to their families and their bloodlines is a trifecta between the government, the family, and the specialists in the field of family group conferencing, Manaway, is but a small step to reconciliation.
This tattoo on my arm here roughly translates to a Lakota saying which says, all of my relations, and meaning that we are all related. And so if I could ask you to take anything from here, it would be one, to carry something that I mentioned earlier, which is the knowledge that an injustice against one of us as relations is an injustice against all of us. And so if you're not working actively every day to address those 3 pillars that I mentioned, you're being a colonizer. So what I would challenge you to do is to look at your everyday life, your actions, think critically about the things you see in the news and say, how does this advance? Or what part of those 3 pillars does it address? And if it doesn't, how could it address one? And if it does, how could it address more? You can always do more. And as all of my relations, I would say miigwech for being here today and listening to all of us, and thank you so much.
I just want to say thank you very much, Chimigwech, to Rotary International, to our friends, Rotary Toronto, to the Honoring Indigenous Peoples Advisory Committee and Board, and thank you so much to Charlie, to Diane, to Rima, to Riley. And just as going out, I want to just repeat something Riley, I think it was you who said, she said, my resistance is existence. And I just want to say thank you to all of you. Have a wonderful rest of the conference and day. And we have one more important person. Please do not move for 1 second. This gentleman is so important that I was out the door and I'm in trouble. I want to introduce Mr. Chris Snyder. Everyone, let's take right now.
Hello everybody, my name is Chris Snyder and I'm the chair of HIP, which as you all know by now stands for Honoring Indigenous Peoples. And part of what I'm to do is to thank the panel. I heard so many applauses during comments. I don't think I've ever been to a conference where so many comments were applauded. And to me, that expresses, certainly so much of what you feel, what I feel. One of the great pleasures of working with Indigenous peoples, every time I come in contact with somebody, I learn something new. Today, I started writing things down and I just gave up. There are just so many new and different things and words of wisdom. And we have so much to learn from each other and to work together. And so I want to thank each person. I'd spend the next hour just sort of commenting on what everybody has said, but it's just been, to me, a great experience just to listen to people. Just a little bit about HIP. We started about 3 or 4 years ago, and Andre refers to the Rotary Club of Toronto, and yes, I'm a member of that club. But we did, it really became a project of the districts in clubs in Southern Ontario. But it's expanded, and we now have approximately 150 clubs involved, one way or the other. Our focus is education and awareness. Our vision is to get every Rotary Club in Canada involved in that. And part of our vision is for every Rotary Club to have a connection with an Indigenous community, either in their own community or in some community that's perhaps a little farther away. And it all boils down to what Diane has said repeatedly, which is relationships. It's all about relationships and getting to know each other and removing the distrust and understanding each other. We have so much to learn. We look upon HIP as a movement. And we're not going to set up programs, although within HIP we have opportunities for clubs to be involved. But it's really a movement to get Rotary clubs and Rotarians and everybody else in Canada involved in this particular message. And the things that we've chosen in the reconciliation path are awareness and education. Thank you for coming, and thank you panel and everybody.